The morning Declan Marsh counted his last $47, he did it twice. Not because he thought the number would change, but because some part of him still believed in the slim possibility that he'd miscounted, that somewhere between the crumpled fives and the loose quarters he'd find a margin he'd missed. He hadn't. $47 and some change spread across the kitchen counter like evidence of a verdict already delivered. Outside the window of the third-floor apartment above the coin laundry on Greer Street, Portland, was waking up gray and indifferent, the kind of October morning that made the city look like it had given up trying. He put the bills back in his wallet and listened to the dryer running 2 floors below, that rhythmic mechanical thudding that had become the soundtrack of their lives here. Wren was still asleep. He could hear her breathing through the thin wall between their rooms, that slow and steadfast rhythm that had kept him upright through every version of the past 3 years. He pulled on his one good blue shirt, the one he kept on a separate hanger away from his work clothes, and stood at the bathroom mirror doing up the buttons with the focused attention of a man preparing for something that mattered. 3 years since Faye. He didn't let himself think the fuller version of that sentence anymore, because the fuller version had weight he couldn't carry before 7 a.m. What he allowed himself instead was the condensed accounting: 3 years since the hospital, 2.5 since they'd lost the house on Carver Lane, 2 since he'd moved them into this apartment with the peeling radiator and the neighbor upstairs who walked like she was trying to leave footprints in concrete. 3 years of becoming someone he didn't entirely recognize, a man who checked account balances at 6 in the morning and counted change on his own kitchen counter. Faye had been the kind of woman who laughed too loud at movies and cried at insurance commercials, who made the best chocolate chip cookies he'd ever tasted and grew tomatoes on the fire escape, even though the landlord had asked her 3 times to take them down. She'd had Wren's eyes, that particular shade of gray-green that looked different depending on the light, and Wren's habit of tilting her head when she was working something out, like the answer was written on the ceiling and she just needed the right angle to read it. The headaches had started when Wren was 3. The diagnosis had come 6 weeks later, and what followed was a 2-year education in how quickly a life could be restructured around a single devastating fact. Progressive, unpredictable, expensive. The medical debt had outlasted the illness. That was the part nobody warned you about, the way the bills kept arriving long after the person they were addressed to had gone stacking up on the counter with a persistence that felt almost cruel. Declan had done everything right, or what he'd believed counted as right. He'd had insurance. He'd had savings. Neither had been enough, and the gap between what he'd had and what the disease had cost was wide enough to swallow the house, the savings account, and the version of himself who'd believed preparation was the same thing as protection. He was on his 2nd cup of coffee when the phone rang. He looked at the screen, felt the particular low-level resistance that Rourke Langton's name always produced in him, and answered anyway. Rourke's voice had that quality it always had, the easy confidence of a man who'd never spent 20 minutes counting quarters. They'd known each other since Declan's early 20s, back when Rourke was just another ambitious guy in a medium-priced suit, trying to get traction in commercial real estate before the traction came, and the suit got more expensive, and the easy confidence calcified into something less likable. They weren't close anymore. They hadn't been close in years, but there was a history between them that Rourke periodically leveraged and Declan periodically allowed, because history had a weight of its own and he hadn't yet figured out how to set it down. "I need a favor." Rourke opened with which meant it wasn't a favor at all. Declan listened. The pitch was this: there was a blind date tonight, 7:30 at Harlow's on Morrison, the kind of restaurant with no prices on the wine list. A woman named Seren set up through a colleague. The man who was supposed to show had complications, specifically a desire not to show, and a professional relationship with the person who'd arranged the date that made a simple cancellation politically unworkable. What Rourke needed was someone to go in the man's place, sit through the evening, and make enough of a poor impression that the woman would never want to be set up again. Not cruel, not mean, just forgettable, just enough to close the loop. $700, Rourke said. Cash, tonight. Declan looked at Wren's sneakers by the door. The left one had a split along the sole that she'd shown him 3 weeks ago, with the same matter-of-fact acceptance that broke his heart every time. the way she'd stopped being surprised by things not working. He thought about the electricity notice on the fridge, the third one, the one with the red ink that meant they were moving from warning to consequence. "Tell me about her," Declan said. Rourke pulled up a photo and texted it. A small image, slightly blurred, a woman at what looked like an outdoor event, turned partially away from the camera. Dark hair. The proportions were different in a way Declan registered without fully processing. Rourke described her briefly. Her name was Seren. She worked at some nonprofit. The date had been arranged through a mutual professional connection, and Rourke's associate needed it neutralized without offense and without traceable cancellation. Declan stared at the photo for a moment, then he said he'd think about it. Rourke let one beat of silence pass before he said, "You still owe me 800 Dec." There it was. The thing Declan had known was underneath the call since the first sentence. 18 months ago, 6 weeks after moving into the Greer Street apartment, he'd borrowed $800 from Rourke when a medical billing dispute had frozen his account during a processing error, and he'd had 48 hours to cover Ren's daycare or lose her spot. He'd paid back $300 over the following year. The remaining $500 had sat between them like a stone and a shoe. Something both of them knew was there, something only Rourke brought up. Declan walked to the window and looked down at the street. A woman was walking a dog the size of a footstool. A teenager was unlocking a bike from the rack outside the laundry. Ordinary morning, ordinary Portland, ordinary life proceeding without any particular interest in his situation. "Tonight," Declan said. 7:30. He woke Ren at 7, made her oatmeal with the brown sugar she liked, sat across from her at the kitchen table while she told him about a dream involving a horse named Copper who could do math. She was missing a tooth on the upper left, lost it 4 days ago, and the gap gave her smile a lopsided quality that somehow made it more genuine, like proof of something real happening in real time. She had Faye's gray-green eyes, and Faye's way of looking at things sideways when she wanted to understand them fully, and she had her own quality that was entirely hers, this steadfast openness, this refusal to approach the world as if it owed her a better version of itself. He dropped her at his mother's house by 9, told her he had something in the evening, would be back before her bedtime. His mother asked no questions. She'd learned to read the spaces between what he said, and she'd learned that filling those spaces with questions didn't help him. He spent the day on a job site in southeast Portland, a commercial renovation that was running 3 weeks behind schedule and over budget in the specific way that made everyone on the crew progressively shorter with each other as the afternoon wore on. He was a welder by training and a project coordinator by accumulated necessity, which meant he spent his days moving between tasks that required precision and conversations that required diplomacy, neither of which he was naturally gifted at, but both of which he'd become competent in through sheer repetition. He thought about the date approximately 16 times between 9 in the morning and 5 in the afternoon, and each time he thought about it, the thing he landed on was the same. He would show up, he would be dull, he would make it through the evening, and he would collect the $700 and put $200 toward the electric bill and $200 toward new shoes for Ren and $300 toward what he still owed Rourke, and by tomorrow morning this would be behind him. He told himself this was a reasonable accounting of the situation. He told himself this with the focused intention of a man who knows somewhere underneath the telling that he's not entirely right. Harlow's was on Morrison in the Pearl District, the kind of restaurant that existed to make people feel like they'd arrived somewhere, with amber lighting that softened everything and a jazz trio in the corner playing at the volume of a suggestion. Declan walked in at 7:25 in his blue shirt and felt the specific social vertigo of being in a place that cost more than he could afford to be in. The hostess had the professional warmth of someone paid to perform it, and she led him through the dining room past couples leaning together over candlelight and businessmen in good suits doing the particular kind of work that happened in restaurants like this, the corner table. He saw her from across the room and stopped walking for just a fraction of a second, the kind of stop that the body makes before the mind is caught up. She was more than the blurred photograph had suggested. Dark hair framing her face in soft waves, wearing a dress the color of deep water, and sitting with the particular posture of someone who had spent years perfecting the art of taking up exactly the space they were entitled to and not apologizing for it. She was small, in the way the photo had indicated proportions that marked her condition even at this distance, and she held her phone in both hands, and her expression in that moment before she looked up was something he hadn't expected, something that landed in his chest before he could prepare for it. Hope, or the fragile cousin of it, the look of someone who had talked themselves into believing that this time might be different. Then she looked up. The transformation was immediate and surgical. Hope to confusion, confusion to recognition, recognition to something cold and precise that made him feel the full weight of what he'd agreed to. She set her phone on the table with a deliberate care that was somehow more withering than any sharp movement would have been. "You're not who I was told." Her voice was level. Declan had made it to the table. He was standing beside the empty chair, and his hands were not entirely steady, and the $700, which had seemed like a reasonable transaction 8 hours ago, had taken on a different quality in the past 30 seconds. "No," he said. "I'm not. I've seen his picture." She tilted her head in that way that was more assessment than curiosity. "His colleague showed me. So what is this?" He pulled out the chair and sat down because his legs had opinions about continuing to hold him up. The smart move, the move that would get him through the evening and to the money and back to his life, was to invent a story. Miscommunication, a scheduling mix-up, something that would let them both save face and get through 90 minutes and go home. He opened his mouth with every intention of doing exactly that. What came out instead was, "I was paid to come here." The silence that followed had a texture to it. She looked at him the way people look at something they're not sure is real. $700. His voice was steady in the way that things go steady when you've passed the point of usefulness for nerves. "The man who was supposed to meet you tonight paid someone to send me instead. The goal was for me to be unpleasant enough or boring enough that you'd write off the whole idea of being set up again. I don't have a better way to say it than that." A couple at the adjacent table glanced over. She didn't look at them. She was still looking at him, and something was moving behind her eyes, something he couldn't read precisely, and then she said something that he hadn't anticipated and wouldn't forget. "You're the first honest person to sit across from me in 2 years. She paused. "That's either very sad or very interesting." She looked at the menu, then back at him. "Sit." "I haven't decided which yet." She ordered sparkling water. He ordered the same. The jazz trio moved into something slower, and for the next 40 minutes, in defiance of everything he'd been paid to accomplish, they talked. She didn't give him her full story in sequence. It came out in pieces the way things come out when someone is testing how much weight a new structure can hold before committing to putting anything valuable inside it. She talked about her work, a nonprofit focused on housing accessibility and disability advocacy in the Pacific Northwest, her voice carrying the particular authority of someone who had built something real rather than inherited it. She'd been doing it for 6 years, starting from a single rented room with a second-hand laptop and a contact list of 43 people, and it was now a staff of 18 with federal grant funding and a seat at tables that had previously not thought to include her. She talked about the dating, not with self-pity, which would have made it easier to listen to, but with the flat precision of someone filing a report. Men who had treated her as a curiosity, an experience, a way of proving something to themselves. Men who had been embarrassed to be seen with her in public, who had let that embarrassment leak out in the form of choosing corner tables and facing her toward the wall. Men who had fetishized her height in ways that had taken her a while to recognize because the vocabulary for it wasn't one she'd had at 22. She'd stopped dating 2 years ago, she said, after a setup that had turned out to be a bet among the organizer's friend group. The prize being a photograph of the date that had been shared in a group chat she'd never seen but heard about 6 weeks later. "I stopped," she said, "because I got tired of finding out what people actually thought after the fact. I thought if I stopped playing, I'd stop losing." She looked at her water glass. His colleague seemed genuine. She talked about him like he was a good person. Declan sat with that. There wasn't anything to say to it that wouldn't sound like he was trying to rebalance a scale that wasn't his to touch. She asked him why he'd done it, not angrily, with the directness of someone who had decided that getting the full picture was worth more than the protection of not knowing. He told her. He told her about Faye, the short version, the version with the relevant facts assembled without ornamentation. He told her about Ren's 7-year-old sneakers with the sole splitting away from the toe. He told her about the $47 and the electric notice and the $800 he still owed Rourke from 18 months ago, that particular piece of history that had made the phone call this morning harder to hang up from. He wasn't asking for her sympathy. He was answering her question. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "So, I'm supposed to feel sorry for you," she said, "because you have a hard life." "No," Declan said. "You're not supposed to feel anything. I'm telling you the truth because you asked and because I already lied to you by showing up here. It's the least I can give you." She studied him the way she had across the room, that same quality of assessment that was neither warm nor cold, but something more demanding than either. "Do you know what it costs," she said, "to spend your entire life proving to people that you're worth basic decency, not worth admiration, not worth exceptional treatment, worth the same level of ordinary respect that everyone else gets without having to demonstrate it first?" She wasn't asking him to answer. "I didn't choose achondroplasia. I didn't choose to be born into a body that everyone has an opinion about before I've said a word. But I've spent 31 years paying for it anyway, in all the small ways that don't show up anywhere and don't count as anything and just accumulate." Declan didn't say that she wasn't less than anything. He'd thought it, but she'd specifically told him not to reach for easy things, and that line would have been exactly that. Instead, he said nothing, and the nothing landed differently than words would have. She picked up her bag. "I'm going to leave now," she said, "because I need to not be here anymore tonight. But I want you to know that your honesty doesn't make what happened acceptable. It just makes you a better person than the man who paid you." She stood, and there was nothing diminished in the movement, nothing that conceded anything to the evening or its conditions. "If we happen to cross paths again," she said, "maybe we'll talk then." She walked out through the dining room with a composure that cost her something he could see that, but that she paid without negotiating. He watched her go and then sat in the amber light while the jazz trio played and the other tables continued their evenings, and the waiter approached cautiously to ask if he'd be ordering. He left without ordering. The night air on Morrison was cold enough to make the eyes water, or that was what he told himself, standing on the sidewalk outside Harlow's with his good shirt doing nothing against the wind, and $700 in his jacket pocket that suddenly felt wrong in the specific way that money feels wrong when you've understood what it cost. He sat in his truck for 22 minutes without starting the engine. The next morning he drove downtown. Rourke's office was in a converted brick building in the Pearl, the kind of address that converted cost per square foot into status signaling, and his receptionist had the evaluative gaze of someone whose job included making certain categories of visitor feel the weight of the distance between where they were and where the office was. Declan said Rourke was expecting him, which was not technically true but produced the result he needed, and he was shown through a glass-walled corridor to an office that looked out over the street. Rourke looked up from his desk with the expression of a man anticipating confirmation. "How'd it go? Did she buy it?" Declan set $700 on the desk in 2 stacks the way he'd organized it that morning on his kitchen counter, and watched Rourke's expression change the way weather changes quickly and without apology. "What's this?" "Not a question." "The deal's done. I'm not keeping it." Rourke leaned back in his chair with the particular frustration of a man whose clean plan had developed an unexpected complication. He said that Declan had already done the job, that the money was earned, that he was being an idiot. He said several versions of this in succession, the volume and vocabulary shifting as the conversation failed to move in the direction he wanted. Then Declan said, "There was no colleague Rourke. There was no guy who needed a stand-in." The office got quiet in a way that offices do when something true has been said that nobody was quite ready for. He'd had time to work it out in the truck the night before, and more time this morning over coffee while Ren slept. The setup had too many edges that didn't quite match. Rourke's specific knowledge of which restaurant, the particular detail about wanting her to stop agreeing to setups rather than simply wanting one, canceled the fact that he'd known her name and her organization. These weren't details you had about a stranger your associate was seeing. These were details you had about someone you'd been paying attention to. Her organization filed a report, Declan said, 2 years ago. A real estate development fraud investigation, the kind that freezes projects and makes people's names show up in federal documents. He watched Rourke's face. You were attached to that project. Rourke said nothing. This wasn't about some guy not wanting to go on a date. The words were steady, which surprised Declan slightly because the anger underneath them was not. This was about making sure she associated blind dates with humiliation, so she'd stop the work that made your name visible. Or just because you wanted to see her embarrassed. I'm not sure which is worse. Rourke said the name of the development without meaning to a single reflexive word that confirmed everything. Declan picked up the truck keys from his pocket. Keep the money, he said, and don't call me again. He was at the door when Rourke said it in the tone of a man throwing the last thing in his hands. You think she'll trust you now? After what you showed up and did? You're nothing to her. You're just another mistake she made by thinking someone might be decent. Declan opened the door and walked through it. The thing about Rourke's last line was that it stayed with him for the rest of the day with the specific persistence of things that are partly true. He had shown up. He had sat across from her under false pretenses. He had taken the job in the first place. That the full accounting of his actions included returning the money and confronting Rourke did not erase the first item on the list, and he knew enough about integrity to understand that you didn't get to subtract the bad from the ledger just because you'd added some good afterward. He picked up Ren from his mother's house at 4, drove home through the gray afternoon, made spaghetti from what was in the cupboard, watched her eat with the focused commitment she brought to all forms of fuel intake. She told him about a girl at school who could whistle with 2 fingers and had agreed to teach her, but the first lesson hadn't gone well, and her fingers tasted like the cafeteria. He laughed. It was the first time he'd laughed since the previous morning, and it felt like something coming loose. After she was in bed, he sat at the kitchen table and tried to locate the thing he was feeling, and found it was something in the neighborhood of shame, but not quite. Shame was the feeling you had when you'd done something and hidden it. This was the feeling you had when you'd done something and acknowledged it fully, and understood that acknowledgement wasn't the same as repair. He also found underneath that something smaller and more unexpected. The memory of her saying, "You're the first honest person to sit across from me in 2 years." Not as a compliment, as a diagnosis, as a statement about the state of things that was so specific it had to be true. He didn't let himself turn that over too many times. It wasn't his to turn over. She'd walked out the door, and that was the end of the story. 10 days later, on a Saturday morning in mid-October, he took Ren to the library. They went every Saturday. It had started as a practical solution, the library being free and Ren's appetite for books being extensive and their budget being what it was. But it had become something else over the months, a ritual with its own weight, the one piece of their week that the circumstances hadn't managed to compromise. The Selwood branch on Umatilla was Ren's library, not because it was the closest, but because it had the best children's section with a rainbow carpet and beanbag chairs shaped like animals, and a librarian named Greta who knew Ren by name and always had something specific pulled aside for her. Ren went immediately to the animal books, and Declan wandered toward the new releases, not looking for anything in particular, running his thumb along spines without reading the titles, doing what he did at the library on Saturday mornings when Ren was occupied, which was approximately nothing, and finding it sufficient. He turned a corner in the fiction section and stopped. She was standing near the window in jeans and a cream sweater, a book held in both hands, reading the back cover with the concentrated attention of someone making a genuine decision. She hadn't seen him. He had perhaps 2 seconds in which the geometry of the moment still permitted him to take Ren and leave quietly, and he spent them looking at her in the clear autumn light coming through the library window and understanding that he was not going to take Ren and leave quietly. "Seren," she looked up. The composure arrived before the recognition, and then both were present simultaneously, and he watched her decide how to hold them together. "You," she said. "I know I'm the last person you want to see." He kept his distance. The space between them had an appropriate weight. "Ren and I come here every Saturday. I couldn't walk away without trying once more to tell you that I'm sorry. Not the version where I explain circumstances, just the version where I say it and mean it and leave you alone after." You already apologized. In a restaurant where you'd just been humiliated and were trying to hold yourself together, that's not the same as saying it when you have room to hear it. She studied him. The book was still in her hands, held like something she hadn't quite decided to put down. "Why did you give the money back?" she said, and then before he could answer, "That wasn't a guess. I was testing whether you'd tell the truth or construct something flattering." He told her the truth. He told her about the conversation with Rourke, about the development fraud, about the specific moment when he'd understood that this had never been about a man not wanting to go on a date. He told her about driving downtown that morning with the $700 in 2 stacks and putting it on Rourke's desk without a speech, because a speech would have been for his own benefit. She listened without interrupting, which was its own form of judgment, the kind that required more of you than objection did. Before he could finish, a sound came from behind the biography shelves, small and definite, and building toward announcement, "Daddy, the horse is okay." The storm missed her beach, and Ren came around the corner at speed and stopped dead when she saw there was someone else in the conversation, her forward momentum converting immediately into the stillness of intense assessment. Her head tilted. "Are you a fairy?" Ren's voice had the matter-of-fact quality of a scientist proposing a reasonable hypothesis. "Because in my books fairies are small and they have secrets. You look like you have secrets." Something moved in Seren's face, something that came from underneath the composure and arrived without permission. She laughed, and it was genuine, the kind of laugh that happens before you can decide whether to let it. "I'm not a fairy," she said in the tone of someone reporting a personal disappointment. "I'm just a person who didn't grow as tall as most people." Ren considered this. The consideration lasted approximately 4 seconds, which for Ren was a long time. "My daddy's body works differently too," she announced. "Sometimes his back hurts really bad, and once he cried in the kitchen when he thought I wasn't looking, but I was looking because I needed water. He said it was allergies, but we don't have allergies." "Ren." His voice did a complicated thing on the way out. "You always say I should tell the truth." She looked between them with the genuine confusion of someone who has followed instructions correctly and arrived at an unexpected outcome. Seren was looking at him differently now. Not with the controlled assessment of the restaurant or the careful neutrality of a minute ago, but with something that lived closer to the surface. "What's your name?" she asked Ren. "Ren Marsh. What's yours?" "Seren." "That's a good name?" Ren nodded with the authority of someone who had opinions about names and wasn't embarrassed to act on them. "It sounds like something from a book, like a character who knows things." She held up the horse book, which had a painted cover showing a white mare on a rocky coastline. "Do you want to see? The horse's name is Copper, and there was a big storm, but it missed the beach, so she's okay." Seren crouched down, bringing herself to Ren's level, and looked at the book with the attention it had apparently been offered to receive. "Tell me about Copper," she said. Ren took her hand and pulled her toward the children's section, talking steadily about Copper and the storm and the beach and a secondary character named Old Mick, who she had complicated feelings about her voice carrying back around the fiction shelves with the easy certainty of someone who has assessed a situation and decided it's good. Declan stood in the space they'd left and felt something in his chest that didn't have a clean name. He followed at a distance, stopping at the entrance to the children's section to watch Ren show Seren the full accounting of her Saturday selections, explaining each one with the thoroughness of a curator who had been waiting for someone to ask. Seren listened, not with the patient performance of an adult enduring a child's interest, but with genuine attention, asking questions that showed she'd been paying attention to the previous answer, treating Ren's enthusiasm as the valuable thing it was. It was not a small thing to be listened to that way. Declan knew this because no one had listened to him that way in quite some time. Eventually, Ren crashed into a beanbag shaped like a frog. The horse book open across her lap, her eyes making the slow negotiations with sleep that always preceded losing the argument. Seren stood and walked back toward where Declan was standing near the shelves. "She's extraordinary," Seren said. It wasn't offered as a pleasantry. It was a specific observation made by someone who meant it. "She keeps me standing," Declan said. "When everything else went sideways, she was the reason I got up in the morning. Not because I was inspired, because she needed breakfast and I was the only one who could make it." Seren was quiet for a moment, looking at Wren in the beanbag, one small arm draped over the cover of the horse book. "I come here most Saturdays," she said, not quite looking at him. "There's a book club. We meet at 10:30. We're usually here by 9. She looked at him then, the full version of looking without the barriers up. "I don't forgive you," she said. "I want to be clear about that. Not yet." "That's more than I deserve." "Probably." The corner of her mouth did something careful. "Same time next Saturday," she said. "Don't make it weird." She went back to the fiction section. He stood in the entrance to the children's section and listened to Wren's breathing go slow and even, and thought about a woman who had been handed every reason to walk away from kindness and had spent 2 years protecting herself with careful reason and complete justification, and who had today crouched down on a library carpet to look at a painted horse on a rocky coastline because a 7-year-old had asked her to. He thought about Rourke's last line still sitting in him from 2 mornings ago. "She'll never trust you. You're just another mistake." He looked at Wren asleep on the frog-shaped beanbag, the gap in her smile visible even from here, and thought then, "I'll be the mistake that shows up every Saturday until the evidence changes." Outside, through the library windows, the October sky had gone from gray to the particular pale gold of late morning, the kind of light that doesn't make promises, but doesn't refuse them either. The second Saturday, Wren spotted Seren first from halfway across the library and produced a sound of pure delight that made 3 adults lower their books and look over. Seren was already smiling by the time Wren reached her, the kind of smile that arrived ahead of any decision to have it, and Wren grabbed her hand with the easy confidence of someone claiming what was already theirs and pulled her toward the new arrivals in the children's section without pausing to ask if Seren had other plans. She didn't. That became clear quickly. She had a book club at 10:30, and she was there by 9, and the hour between belonged to Wren, and Seren gave it over without negotiating the terms. Declan watched from a distance those first weeks close enough to intervene if Wren's enthusiasm crossed from endearing into overwhelming, far enough to give Seren the space to decide for herself what she wanted this to be. He was aware of the specific danger of wanting it to be something. He was aware of it, and he kept the awareness close the way you keep a hand near something fragile when you're moving through a crowded room. The third Saturday, Seren found a book about bioluminescent sea creatures and brought it to Wren unprompted, because Wren had mentioned 2 weeks earlier that she thought the ocean was probably full of things that humans hadn't had the right questions to find yet. Wren's response to this was to look at the book, then at Seren, then back at the book with the expression of someone receiving confirmation of a theory they'd been developing privately. Declan noticed. He noticed the way Seren had held on to a detail that most adults would have let pass through, and he filed it in the place where he kept things he wasn't ready to examine directly. By the 5th Saturday they had a rhythm. Wren and Seren for the first hour, books and conversation, and the occasional elaborate game that Wren invented on the spot and expected both parties to commit to without rehearsal. Then Wren in a beanbag losing the battle with her own energy, and the 2 adults at the edge of the children's section, or out on the library's side patio when the weather allowed talking in the way that people talk when they're both being careful and both pretending not to be. He told her about Faye in pieces the same way she'd given him her own history testing the load before placing weight on it. He told her about the tomatoes on the fire escape at the old house, the ones Faye had grown in defiance of the landlord's requests, which had produced exactly 4 tomatoes in 2 seasons, and which Faye had treated as a significant agricultural achievement. He told her about the morning Faye had come into the kitchen, holding her head in a way that was different from the ordinary way people hold their heads when they have a headache. Something in the angle of it, something that his body had registered before his mind had caught up. He told her about sitting in the neurologist's office 3 weeks later and hearing the words and understanding that there was a version of his future that he'd been building without knowing it was the wrong blueprint. Seren listened in the way that she did everything with her full attention deployed, and no part of her performing the act of paying attention instead of actually paying it. She asked questions that proved she'd heard the previous answer. She didn't rush toward comfort or resolution. She sat with the difficult parts and let them be difficult, which was rarer than it should have been and worth more than she probably knew she was giving. She told him about Georgetown on the fourth Saturday, a full academic scholarship, leaving Portland at 18 and landing in a city that had no particular opinion about her yet, which had felt like oxygen after a childhood of being the only kid in her elementary school with achondroplasia, of being the fact of herself before she was the rest of herself. She'd built things at Georgetown, competencies and contacts, and a framework for understanding what she wanted to do with the particular vantage point her life had given her. She came back to Portland at 22 with a degree in public policy and a clear picture of the work she intended to do, which was the kind of clarity that most people spent a decade trying to locate. She'd changed her name at 23, taking her mother's maiden name and stepping sideways out of the identity that her father's name conferred. The decision had been practical, and it had been protective, and it had been, she said, on the fifth Saturday, the best decision she'd made in that decade of her life, because it had given her 6 years of knowing that the people who showed up for her work had shown up for the work and not for the checkbook attached to her family name. November arrived and the patio became impractical, and they moved inside, finding a corner table in the library's reading room that became theirs by accumulated habit, and the conversations deepened in the way that conversations deepen when both people have stopped auditing every sentence before it exits. It was the evening of the 6th week when he told her about the night Faye died. They weren't at the library. Ren had developed a cold that Thursday and was running a low fever, and Seren had shown up at the apartment on Greer Street on Friday evening with soup from the Thai place on Tacoma and ginger ale and a calm, practical energy that filled the space where Declan had been managing alone. Ren had approved of her immediately and fallen asleep on the couch with a blanket Seren had tucked around her, with the matter-of-fact competence of someone who understood what comfort required without needing it to be an occasion. They sat in the kitchen with tea while Ren slept in the other room, and the apartment was quiet in the specific way it got quiet on Friday evenings, and something about the particular quality of that quiet made the story easier to carry out into the air. She died on a Sunday morning. Declan said, his voice doing the small thing it still did. Sometimes a slight contraction, a brief restructuring. It was April. The window was open. There was an apple tree in the yard below that she'd been watching all winter, waiting for it to do something. There were birds in it that morning. Ren was at my parents' house. I was holding Faye's hand, and I felt the exact moment she left. Not metaphorically, I felt it in my hand. The way you feel a door close in another room. Seren reached across the kitchen table and put her hand over his. She didn't speak. There was nothing available in language that was equal to what he'd just placed in the room, and she understood this, and the understanding was itself a form of grace. He told her about the debt that had come after the systematic dismantling of everything he'd built. He told her about the apartment above the laundry, about the months when Ren kept asking where Mommy was in the way that children do, iteratively, persistently approaching the unanswerable from different angles in hopes of finding the angle where it answers. He told her what he'd told Ren, that Mommy's body had stopped working, but her love hadn't stopped, that she was watching from somewhere they couldn't see, like a star that's still sending light even after it's gone. Ren asked me if Mommy could still see her dreams, he said. I told her yes. I don't know if that's true, but I know what she needed to hear, and I gave her that because she was 4 years old, and she deserved to believe in something gentle. Seren's hand was still on his. Outside, the dryer below them had started its cycle, that familiar rhythmic thudding, and the apartment smelled like the soup they'd heated, and the ginger ale going flat on the counter, and something else that Declan recognized slowly as the smell of the apartment when it wasn't empty of other people. Children keep us accountable to being alive, Seren said. They need us so completely that survival stops being optional. You don't get to go under. You just don't get to. He looked at her across the kitchen table and thought about a woman who had been systematically failed by people who should have done better, who had built an entire parallel identity to protect herself from the particular species of disappointment that came with being seen as a resource rather than a person, and who was sitting in his kitchen on a Friday night because his daughter had a cold and she had decided that showing up was what the moment required. She left at 10 after checking on Ren one more time with a gentleness that Declan watched from the doorway of the living room and did not trust himself to comment on. At the door she paused and looked back at him with an expression that was not quite readable and not quite trying to be. "Same time Saturday," she said. "If Ren's fever is gone." It was gone by Saturday morning. 3 weeks later he applied for the coordinator position at Halcyon Construction. He'd heard about it from a guy on his current job site, not from Seren, and he drove to the interview in the 2009 Civic with a folder of documentation he'd spent 2 evenings assembling 3 years of project management by necessity, translated into the language of a formal resume. The interview lasted 40 minutes, and the hiring manager, a compact, methodical woman named Judith, asked the kinds of questions that required specific answers rather than general impressions. He got the call on a Thursday afternoon while he was eating lunch in his truck. The salary was real money, the first real money in 3 years, with benefits and regular hours, and what Judith had described as genuine room for movement within the company if he was as thorough as he'd presented. He sat in the truck for a while after hanging up, not moving, just letting the fact of it settle. He told Seren on Saturday. Her reaction was uncomplicated and genuine. "You got that yourself," she said, with a directness that closed off any attempt to make it less than what it was. "You put together that resume, and you walked in there and you did it." He bought Ren new shoes that weekend, the ones she'd pointed at in the window of the kids' store on Division 3 months ago, and not asked for because she'd already understood at 7 years old the grammar of what they could and couldn't afford. He moved them into a 2-bedroom apartment in Selwood 6 weeks after starting the job, closer to the library, with a second bedroom that meant Ren had a door of her own and a window that looked out onto a yard with a maple tree. Ren walked through the new apartment the first afternoon with her arms slightly out from her sides, as if she were measuring the space by wingspan. Then she stood at the window looking at the maple tree, which was fully bare by then in late November, and she said, "Daddy, are we okay now?" Her voice had the particular quality of a question that had been held for a long time before being asked. "We're more than okay," Declan said. "We're good." She turned from the window with an expression that was phase in its architecture, that same way of receiving good news, as if testing whether it was structurally sound before celebrating it. Then she decided it was. "Good," she said, and went to inspect her closet. December came in cold and clear. The work at Halcyon was demanding in the way that good work is demanding, the kind that required all of him and then developed more of him in the process of requiring it. He was on a large mixed-use renovation project in the Central East Side, managing 3 subcontractor teams and a timeline that had been optimistic from the first day and required daily recalibration. He was good at it. He discovered this about himself the way you discover things that were always true, but required the right context to become visible. It was on a Tuesday in the second week of December that he saw Rourke Langton on the job site. Rourke was standing at the far end of the structural corridor with the site supervisor wearing a hard hat over a jacket that was not appropriate for active construction, and holding a clipboard with the posture of a man who wanted to be perceived as comfortable in a setting that was new to him. Declan stopped walking. The cold air in the corridor had a metallic quality, the smell of cut metal and concrete dust, and Rourke saw him at the same moment, and the recognition between them landed like a match finding a surface. Halcyon had taken on a new subcontractor for the mechanical systems work, a mid-sized operation called Crest and Darrow. Rourke was Crest and Darrow's business development lead, which meant he was on this job site on this project in the same physical space as Declan 5 days a week. Rourke recovered first, which was consistent with who Rourke was. He extended his hand with the specific calibration of someone choosing performance over honesty, and Declan shook it briefly because the alternative required an explanation he wasn't prepared to have with the site supervisor standing 3 feet away. Rourke smiled. "Small world," he said in the tone of someone for whom no world was small enough that he couldn't navigate it. After the site supervisor moved on, Rourke stepped closer. His voice dropped to the register of a conversation that wasn't supposed to be witnessed. He said that he was aware things had ended badly, that he harbored no particular ill will, that he hoped Declan could be professional about the situation. He said this with the fluency of a man who had converted worse positions into workable ones before. Then he said, "I know about the library, I know about the Saturdays. Declan's hands were very still at his sides. "She's not for you, Cal." Rourke held eye contact with the specific comfort of someone who believed that eye contact was itself a form of winning. "She never was. You know what she'd think if she understood the full picture. Not the version where you return the money and feel good about yourself. The version where you sat in that restaurant for 40 minutes. The version on tape." The cold air moved through the corridor. Somewhere further in the building a drill started and stopped. "I have the recording," Rourke said. "The restaurant had a speaker system. The tables in that corner have ambient mics for the music feed. I had someone pull the audio from that night." He let that sit for a moment. "Your voice acknowledging the arrangement, explaining the terms. I have it. I haven't done anything with it, yet. But I think you should consider whether this situation is one you want to remain in, given the collateral available." Declan looked at him for a long moment. He thought about $700 on a desk. He thought about the exact moment he'd understood what Rourke's actual motivation had been. He thought about what Seren had said in the library on the first real Saturday. "You're the first honest person to sit across from me in 2 years. Do what you have to do," Declan said. And then he left Rourke standing in the corridor and walked directly to his truck and called Seren. She picked up on the third ring. He told her everything in the same sequence it had happened, without editing toward a more flattering version of himself. He told her about seeing Rourke on the job site, about the recording, about the threat that had been delivered in the careful language of a man who wanted deniability. He told her before Rourke could, because she deserved to hear it from him, and because every version of integrity he'd managed to build since October required this specific action in this specific moment. Seren was quiet on the other end for long enough that he could hear her breathing. Then, "Okay." One word carrying more weight than one word should be able to carry. "I wanted you to know from me," he said. "Whatever you decide to do with that." Another pause. "I'll call you tomorrow," she said. She didn't call the next day. She didn't call the day after. On the third morning, Declan sat on the floor of the kitchen at 2 a.m, his back against the cabinets, the apartment completely quiet above and below and around him, and it occurred to him that this was the same posture, the same kitchen floor geometry that Wren had described once years ago in a library to a woman she'd just met with. The unself-conscious honesty of someone reporting observable facts. He didn't cry this time. He sat with it, the uncertainty and the waiting, and he understood that this was what it cost to have been the person he'd been in October. Not the money. Not the confrontation with Rourke. This sitting on a kitchen floor at 2 a.m, not knowing if the most unexpectedly important person to enter his life in 3 years was going to walk back out of it because of a recording that documented accurately a version of himself that he had moved past but could not erase. He found 3 sheets of paper in the kitchen drawer and a pen that worked, and he wrote her a letter. Not an apology. He'd already apologized twice, and both times she'd told him she'd heard it, and adding a third would be reaching for his own comfort rather than giving her anything useful. What he wrote instead was a factual account in chronological order of every decision he'd made from the moment Rourke had called to the moment he'd walked off the job site and dialed her number. He wrote it without ornamentation, without the softening language that would have made him look better, without any construction that prioritized his own feeling of having done the right thing eventually over the plain sequence of what had happened. He described the $47 and the decision they'd produced. He described the restaurant and what had actually occurred there and what he'd actually felt during it. He described the morning after in Rourke's office and what he'd discovered about the development fraud. He described the library and the Saturdays and the exact quality of what those mornings had become for him, written without performance, because performance was the one thing he was certain she could identify at distance. At the bottom of the third page he wrote one sentence that was not part of the account. "You deserve the full truth. You always have. That's the only thing I'm certain I can give you." He folded the letter, and in the morning before Wren woke up he drove to Seren's building and put it through the mail slot in the lobby door. Then he went home and made oatmeal and waited. Rourke sent the recording to the board of Seren's nonprofit on a Wednesday. It was a clean audio file, 12 minutes of conversation from the ambient mic at the corner table, and it contained Declan's voice acknowledging the arrangement at Harlow's with enough specificity to be damaging without any of the context that followed it. The board chair, a retired attorney named Morrow, who had been skeptical of Seren's personal life intersecting with the organization's public profile before this, called an emergency session for the following Friday. Seren spent 3 of those days in her apartment. Declan didn't reach out beyond the letter. This was the most difficult thing he'd done since returning the money, this specific restraint, because every instinct he had wanted to be useful, and the most useful thing he could do was to not make her feel managed. On Saturday morning, his phone showed a message sent at 6:47 a.m. "Is Ren okay?" He looked at it for a moment. "She misses you," he wrote back. The response came 30 seconds later. "I'll be at the library." He was there at 9. She arrived at 9:15, and Ren, who had been told nothing, and needed to be told nothing, because Ren's instruments for reading the emotional weather of a room were calibrated beyond what any 7-year-old should reasonably require, simply went to her and held on for a moment, and Seren held on back, and Declan stood at the entrance to the children's section and looked at the ceiling. Seren stood before the nonprofit board on Friday of the following week and told them everything. Not a managed version. Not a narrative constructed to minimize damage. She told them about Harlow's and what had actually happened, about the $700 returned the next morning, about Rourke Langton and the development fraud and the motivation behind the setup. She described the last 8 weeks with the same precision she brought to testimony she gave in policy hearings, which meant it was specific and evidenced and unsparing about the parts that reflected poorly on her own judgment alongside the parts that reflected poorly on everyone else's. She ended with, "The man on that recording returned every dollar the following morning. He had $47 in his account, and his daughter needed new shoes. He gave back money that would have changed his month because he understood what keeping it would cost." That's the only character reference I need, and it should be sufficient for this board as well. The vote was 6-1. Rourke's subcontracting agreement with Crest and Darrow was under review by the second week of January, when Declan submitted documentation to Halcyon's project director showing a pattern of material cost inflation in Rourke's billing that placed the discrepancy at roughly $22,000 over the course of the project's first phase. He'd found the first anomaly in November cross-referencing invoices against the supplier receipts during a routine audit of Phase 1 completion costs. He'd spent 3 weeks verifying it before reporting it because he wanted to be right rather than fast. The project director forwarded the documentation to Halcyon's legal team on a Thursday. Rourke was off the project by the following Monday. He didn't contact Declan. He sent a brief email to the project director disputing the findings, which the legal team considered alongside the documentation for approximately 4 days before issuing a formal notice of breach. Declan told Ren that evening that sometimes doing the right thing was harder than not doing it. Ren looked up from her dinner. "Did you do it anyway?" He said yes. She nodded with the gravity of someone checking an expected box. "Good," she said. "Can we have pancakes this weekend?" They had pancakes. February came in gentle, which Portland occasionally allowed. The Saturdays at the library continued, and the Friday evening dinners had become a fixture alternating between the apartment on Greer and Seren's place, and Fig the cat had developed a complicated relationship with Ren that involved allowing himself to be carried in ways that were structurally questionable while maintaining an expression of absolute dignity throughout. The 3 of them had a shape now, a particular configuration that was visible to anyone who looked, which everyone in both their social circles was now looking. On a Tuesday in the middle of the month, Seren stopped by the job site with coffee and the information that she'd run into Judith in a professional context, and that Judith had described Declan as the most thorough project coordinator she'd hired in 6 years, and the way Seren delivered this with a precision that made it impossible to attribute to anything but fact meant more to him than he knew how to acknowledge in the parking lot of a construction site. One evening in late February, Ren was already in bed and the apartment was doing its Friday night quiet thing, and Seren was on the couch with Fig and a book she wasn't actually reading because she'd turned the same page 4 times, and Declan was in the kitchen doing nothing that needed doing, and the awareness that had been building since October with the slow inevitability of a tide, had reached a point where continuing to manage it required more energy than he had available. He came back into the living room and sat on the opposite end of the couch and looked at her. "I've been in love with you since you told me to sit down instead of throwing me out of that restaurant," he said. Not a speech, not a constructed thing, just the truth located and placed in the air between them with the specific vulnerability of something that cannot be taken back once it's been said. Seren set the book down and looked at him with an expression that had been waiting, he understood now, to be looked at directly. "I know," she said. "I've been waiting 3 months for you to say it." Something came into her eyes that was neither careful nor guarded the full version of what had been there in pieces since the library carpet in October. "I've been in love with you since you wrote 3 pages without once trying to make yourself look better than you were." He moved across the couch and she met him halfway, and the kiss was the kind that happens between two people who have waited long enough that the waiting has become part of the thing itself, and when they pulled apart, she was smiling with her whole face. From the hallway, a theatrical stage whisper, "Finally!" Ren appeared in the doorway in her pajamas, her expression combining deep satisfaction with the specific pride of someone whose prediction has been confirmed. "I told Fig this would happen. He didn't believe me, but I was right." She looked between them. "Can I have a snack?" "I think this is a snack occasion." Declan looked at Seren, who was laughing in the way she laughed when something caught her fully off guard, and the apartment on Greer Street felt for the first time since they'd moved into it like a place where something was beginning rather than a place where something had ended. He got Ren a snack. Outside, Portland was doing the February thing, light rain on the window glass, the maple tree in the yard visible through the kitchen window. He stood at the counter and listened to Ren in the other room explaining to Seren in exhaustive detail why Fig was, in Ren's professional opinion as a 7-year-old, the most emotionally sophisticated cat currently living in the state of Oregon. Seren's response was not audible from the kitchen, but whatever it was made Ren laugh the way she laughed when something was genuinely funny rather than just agreeable, and Declan held on to that sound for a moment before he brought the snack in the way you hold on to something that you've learned not to take for granted. March arrived the way Portland marches do, cycling through 4 kinds of weather in a single afternoon rain, giving way to pale sun, giving way to wind, giving way to something almost warm that made you believe briefly in the possibility of spring before it withdrew the offer. Declan noticed this in the way he'd started noticing things again, the sensory details of ordinary days, the quality of light on wet pavement, the smell of the maple tree in the Selwood yard beginning its slow return to itself. It had been a long time since he'd noticed things like that. He hadn't been sure he still could. The weeks after February moved with a different weight than the weeks before it. Not lighter exactly, more like correctly distributed the way a load becomes manageable, not when you reduce it, but when you learn where to put it. Seren was at the apartment most Friday evenings and several Tuesdays, and Ren had quietly restructured her world to include this as a permanent feature rather than a pleasant irregularity, the way children absorb what they decide is good and hold it without negotiating the terms. Fig had migrated over in stages, first his food bowl, then his preferred blanket, then Fig himself, who now occupied the armchair in the living room with the settled authority of someone who had assessed the situation and chosen his permanent posting. Declan was careful with himself about what this meant. He knew what he was being careful about, and he didn't pretend otherwise, not to himself in the kitchen at 6 in the morning, not in the truck on the way home from a job site, when his mind went to the particular quality of her laugh when something caught her fully off guard. He'd loved one person completely and lost her, and the loss had restructured everything, not just the external geography of his life, but the internal one, the map of what he believed was possible and what the cost of believing it might be. He wasn't afraid of loving Seren. He was afraid of what loving someone again confirmed about the size of what you could lose, which was a different fear entirely, and one that reason couldn't dissolve because it was structurally true. You couldn't have one without accepting the other. The same opening that let things in was the same opening they left through. He was sitting with this on a Saturday morning in late March when Ren appeared in the kitchen doorway in her pajamas, her hair suggesting a dream life of considerable activity, her expression carrying the specific gravity of a child who has decided that a thing needs to be said and has been building towards saying it since she woke up. She climbed onto the kitchen stool and looked at him with Faye's eyes in her own face, that gray-green that shifted with the quality of the light. "Daddy." She pulled her sleeve over her hand, which was what she did when she was assembling something carefully. "Are you going to ask Miss Seren to stay forever?" He set down his coffee mug. "I'm thinking about it." Ren was quiet for a moment in the way she was quiet when she was deciding something rather than considering it. Then, "Stop thinking." Her voice had a patience in it that exceeded her 7 years. "She already decided. I can tell." He asked her how. She looked at him with the expression of someone who has arrived at the answer by a completely different road and is mildly surprised the question is still being asked. "Because she looks at you like you're the answer to something she forgot she was asking." He stayed with that after Ren went to get dressed. The coffee went lukewarm in front of him. Outside the kitchen window, the maple tree in the yard was showing the first suggestion of buds, that early stage where the green hasn't committed to being green yet, but the intention is visible. Faye had grown tomatoes on fire escapes in defiance of landlord requests and Portland rain and every reasonable assessment of the conditions, because she'd believed that things worth having required exactly that willingness to grow them in places that hadn't offered to cooperate. He drove to the jewelry store on Hawthorne that afternoon while Ren was at his mother's house. The man at the counter was named Patrick, and he had the good quality of listening more than talking, and Declan told him plainly what he was looking for. Simple. Not understated to the point of being unconsidered. A single stone something with weight without performance. He found it in the third case, a round diamond on a white gold band, clean and unambiguous, right in the way that some things are right before you've articulated why. At the register he stopped. He told Patrick to hold it. He drove to his mother's house, walked through the back door into the kitchen where Ren was involved in what appeared to be the serious business of banana bread production, flour on her left cheek, and he sat down at the table and told her what he was planning. All of it, including the part he needed to say before anything else, that the ring he'd found was simple, a single stone, the kind Faye had loved, and he needed to know if that was all right. Ren set down the spoon. She looked at the mixing bowl for a moment, and in the quality of that pause, he could see her doing the thing she did when she was holding something carefully, giving it the weight it deserved. "Mom liked things that were real," she said, her voice carrying an age that didn't always live there. "She would have liked Seren." She looked up at him. "Say yes for both of us, Daddy." He went back to the jewelry store the next morning. The question of when and where arranged itself without force. The last Saturday of April fell exactly 6 months after the evening at Harlow's, which was not a round number but felt when he held it like the right kind of imprecision, the kind that belonged to things that were real rather than constructed. He called Greta at the library and asked if he could borrow access to the children's section on the Friday evening after closing. He explained only that he wanted to do something there that mattered. Greta, who had watched this whole story accumulate across 8 months of Saturday mornings, said yes without requiring a longer explanation. Before any of that, he needed to speak to Holt Vander. He'd met Seren's father 4 times. 3 dinners at the Lake Oswego house. A property large enough to have a name on the gate and a kitchen that Holt used himself with the focused pleasure of a man whose professional life involved delegating everything and whose personal life was organized around the things he refused to hand off. Holt was 68 with steel gray hair and the kind of directness that came from decades of having no practical reason to soften things, and he was intimidating in the specific way that very direct people are intimidating, which was harder to prepare for than the coldness of wealth, because it required you to simply be equal to it. Declan arrived at the 4th dinner early while Seren was finishing a work call. Holt opened a bottle of red without ceremony, and they stood in the kitchen with the late afternoon light on the lake through the window, and the thing Declan had come to say sitting between them like a fact waiting to be acknowledged. He told Holt what he intended, plainly, without architecture around it. Holt listened without interrupting. He looked at the lake for a moment, then back at Declan, and his expression was the expression of a man taking a measurement he'd been waiting to take. "I know about the $700, he said. "I've known since November." Declan didn't move. He'd considered that this was possible. He'd considered that a man who had spent 4 decades protecting significant things would have looked at the person in his daughter's life with the thoroughness that protecting significant things required. "Then you know I returned it," he said. "I know you returned it the next morning with $47 in your account." Holt turned the wine glass by its stem. "I had you looked into. Your record is clean. Your finances are what they are, which is a circumstance and not an indictment." A pause. "But more than the investigation, you called my daughter yourself before that man could reach her. You handed her the information and let her decide what to do with it. That's not someone running an angle. That's someone who understands that the people you love are owed the full picture, not the version that's convenient for you." The kitchen held the word that had arrived in it. Then Holt said, "There's something else you should know before you ask her." He set the glass down with deliberate care. "In the days before Seren's board voted a woman named Adayeze, who has known my daughter for 10 years and sits on that board, went to the other members privately. She'd done her own investigation of the recording and its source. She laid out the full account of Rourke Langton's history with Seren's organization, his motivation, and the sequence of events from October forward, including the fact that you'd called Seren yourself before the recording was sent." He looked at Declan steadily. "I knew what Adayeze intended to do. I chose not to intervene, not to use my resources to manage the outcome. My daughter had the right to win that on her own ground." Something moved in his expression, something that was not quite pride because it was too specific for that word. "She walked into that room and told the truth about everything, including the parts that reflected poorly on her own judgment in agreeing to the setup at all. 6-1. He extended his hand. "You have my blessing, for whatever it's worth to you." Declan shook it. "It means a great deal," he said, because it was true and because Holt deserved the plain version. Seren arrived from her call and they had dinner, and Holt told stories about Seren at 9 years old that were both accurate and unflattering in the specific way that parental stories are calibrated to be, and Seren endured them with the expression of someone who has learned that resistance only extends the process. Iris Holt's partner caught Declan's eye across the table at one point and smiled in the way of someone who had context he didn't and was enjoying having it. On the drive home with Wren asleep in the back seat, Seren looked out the passenger window at the Portland lights and said quietly, "He likes you, you know. He doesn't like most people." Declan kept his eyes on the road. "I know," he said. "I think I understand why that matters." Seren turned to look at him with the full version of her attention, the unguarded one. "It matters," she said, "because he's spent 20 years being suspicious of everyone who got close to me, and for good reason. The fact that he isn't suspicious of you is the most honest endorsement available." She reached across and put her hand over his on the gear shift. They drove the rest of the way home in the comfortable silence of people who have stopped needing to fill the quiet between them. April moved through its weeks. At Halcyon, the Central East Side project finished Phase 2 on schedule, the first time Judith had seen a phase close on the original date in 4 years, and she said this to Declan with the directness of someone extending recognition that was earned rather than managed. He'd found his footing at the company in the way he'd found footing in most things that mattered, through thoroughness rather than speed. And the footing was solid now in a way that had its own quiet satisfaction, separate from everything else, belonging only to him. Seren's nonprofit broke ground on a new accessible housing development in North Portland on a Tuesday in mid-April. Declan went and stood at the back of the small crowd assembled around the site, and when she saw him across the gathered people, her expression did the thing it sometimes did. That brief, unguarded moment before the composure reassembled itself, and he understood that coming had been right. The Friday that Greta had arranged arrived at the end of the month. He told Seren there was something he wanted to show her at the library, that he'd borrowed a key for an hour. She came with the mild, open curiosity she brought to his requests, having learned over 6 months that they were generally worth following. The library was closed, and still interior lights left on by Greta, and their footsteps on the polished floors, had a different sound in the empty building. More presence, the way a voice sounds different in a room that isn't absorbing it with other voices. He led her to the children's section, the rainbow carpet, the beanbag chairs in their animal shapes. The shelves with their painted spines in the particular order that Wren had long ago determined was the correct one and periodically enforced. The space where a 7-year-old had grabbed a stranger's hand 6 months ago and pulled her forward into their lives without asking permission, which was the most Wren thing imaginable. And also Declan had come to understand the most important thing anyone had done in his life since Faye. Seren looked around and he watched her understand where she was and why she was here. The understanding moved through her expression the way weather moves, and she turned to look at him with her eyes already bright, and she didn't say anything yet, which was right because this was his to say first. He took the ring from his jacket pocket and lowered himself to one knee on the rainbow carpet, which was softer underfoot than it looked, and looked up at her. "I walked into a restaurant 6 months ago as the worst version of myself," he said. A man who'd decided that keeping his daughter's lights on was sufficient justification for anything. I told myself it was harmless. I told myself you'd never know. I was wrong about both of those things, and the fact that I was wrong was the most useful thing that ever happened to me. He held the ring toward her in the library light, the small stone catching it cleanly. "You didn't fix me. You didn't rescue me. You just stood in the same place long enough for me to find my way back to who I wanted to be. That's harder than any grand gesture and worth more than all of them combined." He looked up at her. "Seren Ashby, will you let me spend the rest of my life being the man who deserved to meet you?" She was crying before he finished the last sentence, not trying to stop it, her face completely open in a way he'd only seen a handful of times, and each time it had cost her something to allow. "Yes," she said, the word not quite steady but carrying no uncertainty at all. "Obviously, yes. Yes, Declan." He slid the ring onto her finger and stood, and she pulled him down to her and kissed him with the full weight of 6 months of Saturdays and 3 pages of honest handwriting, and every version of showing up when showing up was the harder choice. And when they came apart, she was laughing through the tears in the way that happened when the emotional ledger was too complex to settle in a single expression. 6 months, she said, looking at the ring. "It took you 6 months. I wanted to be certain. I was certain in November." She looked up at him. "Wren was certain in October. Wren told me to say yes for both of them." He watched her face. She meant for herself and for Faye. Seren went still for just a moment, and then she pressed her face against his chest, and he held her in the empty children's section with the beanbag chairs and the rainbow carpet and the painted spines of all the books that Wren had opinions about, and the quiet of the library wrapped around them like something intentional. After a while she pulled back and looked at the ring again in the light. "She's going to be absolutely insufferable about this," she said. "She already has a speech prepared," Declan said. "She told me this morning." Seren laughed, the full, unguarded version, and the sound of it in the empty library was the best thing he'd heard in a building that had given him many good things. They didn't want a long engagement. This was the first thing they agreed on the following morning over breakfast, with Wren between them at the kitchen table, who received the news by examining the ring with the focused assessment of a professional. Looking at her father, looking at Seren, and then announcing with complete authority that Fig would require a formal introduction to the concept of being her brother, and that she had already developed a plan for managing this transition. They decided on October. Not the anniversary of the worst thing Harlow's had been October, but the anniversary of the correction of it. The first Saturday at the library, when Wren had grabbed Serene's hand and pulled, was the date that deserved to be marked. 1 year from the moment things had begun to be different. The ceremony was at the Leach Botanical Garden in outer southeast Portland on a Saturday morning when the October light came through the Douglas firs in long angled shafts that made the space look like it had been arranged by someone with better resources than chance. They'd reserved the garden's main event space, though the guest list was small enough that the intimacy of it was the point rather than a limitation. Declan's parents, his sister and her husband, 4 people from Halcyon who had become genuine presences. Serene's nonprofit colleagues, a dozen of them. People who had built the organization alongside her through the grant cycles and the policy hearings, and the one very difficult week in December when a recording had circulated and she had walked into a boardroom and told the truth until the room understood what the truth meant. Holt and Iris. Adese seated near the front, who had done what she'd done because it was right, and because she'd known Seren long enough to understand that the truth was the only currency that actually settled anything. Ren was the flower girl. She had selected her own dress, purple decided in the first 20 minutes of the first shopping trip, and defended against all subsequent suggestions with a tenacity that left the salesperson visibly impressed and Declan quietly proud. She stood at the end of the aisle with her basket of rose petals held in both hands, and her posture communicating that she understood the weight of her role and intended to honor it. The petals went down in an even and deliberate distribution that suggested prior rehearsal. She finished the aisle, took her position at the front, looked back at the assembled guests with the satisfaction of a professional who has executed correctly and would like the record to reflect this. Holt walked Seren down. He was in a dark suit worn the way good suits are worn by men who stopped thinking about clothes decades ago and now simply wear them. And his face coming down the aisle with his daughter was not the managed face of a man performing composure. It was the unmanaged face of a man feeling the full weight of what he was doing, and the difference between those two faces was visible to everyone in the garden who was paying attention, which was everyone. He placed her hand in Declan's at the end of the aisle. He said something quietly to her, something intended only for her. She laughed in the middle of her tears in the way that was specifically and only hers, and Declan filed that sound in the place where he kept the things he intended to remember precisely. The officiant was Theo, who worked in Seren's policy network and had agreed to get ordained because when Seren had asked her, the only reasonable answer was yes. She spoke briefly about what she'd observed of the two of them across the months she'd watched this unfold, which was more than either of them had realized she'd been watching, and then she gave them the floor. Declan looked at Seren and found that everything he'd spent 3 weeks trying to shape into language was at the moment of saying it very simple. "I was paid $700 to waste your evening," he said. "I returned every dollar the next morning. I would return it 1,000 more times in every version of that night, because every single version of that night leads me here. Not to this garden specifically, not to this date, but to the understanding that the worst decision I ever made was also the most honest correction I ever made, and that the correction was the thing that mattered." He took a breath. "You didn't rehabilitate me. You stood still in a library on a Saturday morning and let a 7-year-old ask you if you were a fairy, and you crouched down to answer her like the question deserved the full weight of your attention. That's who you are. That's who I get to build a life with." He looked at her steadily. "I will show up. I will choose you specifically in all the ordinary moments that don't announce themselves as choices, but are. I will love Ren with you, and build with you, and tell you the truth, even when the truth is the harder thing to carry. And every single day I will understand exactly how different this could have gone." Seren held his gaze through all of it, her eyes bright, her face the open version. "When I walked into Harlow's 6 months before you found me in the library," she said, "I had spent 2 years building a very efficient life around not hoping for this. I was good at it. I had good reasons for it, and I was proud of the architecture." She paused. "You didn't argue with the architecture. You didn't try to dismantle it. You just kept showing up honestly, imperfectly, in the specific way that you show up for things you've decided matter, until I understood that I'd been so focused on protecting myself from the wrong version of this that I'd nearly missed the right one." Her voice held. "You taught me that a second chance isn't an erasure. It's a choice to write the next page differently. You and Ren gave me back the thing I'd stopped believing existed, which is a family made of people who tell each other the truth and show up anyway." She smiled with her whole face. "Thank you for not being able to lie to me in that restaurant. Thank you for walking back through the door on a Saturday morning when you could have walked away. Thank you for the 3 pages. Thank you for choosing this every time there was a choice." The garden was quiet in the way that spaces go quiet when everyone in them is holding something at the same time. They kissed, and the October light shifted through the Douglas firs, and somewhere in the assembled guests, Ren made a sound that was simultaneously a cheer and a sob, and Declan's mother put an arm around her, and Ren allowed it, while maintaining her posture. At the reception in the garden's main room, arranged by Seren's colleagues with the competence of people who organized complex logistics professionally and brought that same precision to table arrangements and lighting choices, Holt gave a toast. He stood with a glass and looked around the room with the expression of a man who had been in enough rooms to recognize when a room was exactly what it was supposed to be. "My daughter spent 8 years building a life on her own terms," he said. "She was correct to do it. The terms she chose were better than any I would have suggested." He looked at Seren. "She found someone who sees her. Not what he hoped she was, not what was convenient for him, not the version he'd constructed before she'd had the chance to be herself in front of him. Someone who looked at her honestly, including the honest acknowledgement of his own failures, and kept looking until he understood what he was seeing." He raised his glass. "I spent a long time being suspicious of everyone who got close to her. I'm grateful I was wrong about this one. Here's to my daughter and her family. May you always choose each other, especially on the days when choosing each other costs something, because those are the only days the choice is real." Wren gave her toast standing on her chair, which she had positioned slightly forward from the table for maximum visibility. She had the posture of someone who had been rehearsing and was prepared to deliver. "I knew Daddy and Miss Seren were going to get married before they knew it," she announced with the confidence of someone reporting confirmed data, "because I could tell they were in love even when they were being extremely slow about saying so." She looked between them. "We are a real family now, which means Fig is officially my brother, and I want everyone to know I'm very happy about that." She paused, her expression shifting to the specific pride of someone whose secondary point is equally important. "Also, Daddy cried 5 times today. I counted. He said it was allergies, but we don't have allergies." She looked at Declan. "The good kind, Daddy. I know." The laughter that came up from the room was warm and layered, the kind that contains affection alongside the humor, and Declan looked at Seren across the table, and she was laughing and crying simultaneously, holding his hand on the tablecloth. And he thought about a man who had counted $47 on a kitchen counter 14 months ago, and believed in the reasonable and defeated way of a man who has lost too much too fast, that the ceiling of his life had been permanently lowered. He had been wrong about the ceiling. He understood now that the ceiling had never been the constraint. The constraint had been his willingness to believe that what had broken could become something different from what it had been before it broke. Not restored, not returned to its original form, but reformed into something that bore the evidence of the breaking and was stronger in exactly those places. Later, when the light outside had shifted to the particular blue of early October evening, and the guests had moved into the comfortable depth of a reception that was going the way good receptions go, Declan and Seren stepped out to the garden's side terrace. The Douglas firs were darkening at their tops. The air carried the specific smell of October in Oregon, turned earth and late blooms, and something clean underneath it all. Through the tall windows of the reception room, visible in the warm interior light, Wren was on the improvised dance floor with Holt Vander instructing him in a sequence of steps with the patient authority of someone who has identified a skills gap and taken personal responsibility for addressing it. Holt was executing the steps with the earnest concentration of a man who had decided that dignity was not the relevant value for this particular activity. Iris was in a chair nearby with her hand over her mouth. Adayezi was laughing with her whole body. Declan's mother had her phone up. "A year ago I had $47, Declan said. He wasn't constructing a line. He was locating himself the way he'd had to learn to do in the hard years, placing himself in accurate relation to the distance traveled, because the distance was real and it deserved to be named. Seren leaned into him, her head against his arm, looking through the windows at the lit room and the people in it. She was quiet for a moment, and he could feel her thinking that particular quality of her attention when she was choosing words with care. "You know what I think about," she said, "when I think about that night at Harlow's now?" She didn't wait for him to answer. "I think about the fact that you couldn't do it. Not that you chose not to. Not that you weighed the options and selected the honorable path. You literally could not sit across from me and lie. Something in you refused before your mind had finished deciding." She tilted her head to look up at him. "That's not a choice you made. That's who you are. It was always who you were, even when you'd temporarily forgotten." He looked at her in the October evening at the ring on her hand, catching the light from the windows at the woman who had walked out of Harlow's with her head high and her dignity intact, and had still 10 days later looked at a man she had every reason to turn away from and said, "Same time next Saturday, don't make it weird." "I'm grateful I couldn't lie," he said. "So am I." She took his hand. "Every single day." Inside, Wren's voice was audible through the glass, correcting Holt's footwork with the specific patience of someone who believes in the student's capacity to improve if given adequate instruction and sufficient repetitions. Holt attempted the correction. The correction was imperfect. Wren demonstrated again, her purple dress moving, her gap-toothed smile visible even through the window, her whole 7-year-old self deployed in the cheerful, serious business of teaching a billionaire to dance at her father's wedding. The Douglas firs held their dark shapes against the sky. The October light finished its long work over Portland in the unhurried way of things that have nowhere else to be and no reason to rush. And Declan Marsh stood on a garden terrace with his wife's hand in his and his daughter's laugh coming through the glass, and understood with the specific clarity of a man who has known the other version that this was not the life he'd expected. It was better. It was built from the broken pieces. And every crack in it was exactly where the light got in.